Hi, welcome to One Fix. On July 7th, 2026, Human Satori team exposed NewsJunkie, a massive coordinated connected television device spoofing operation that generated up to 2 billion invalid bid requests per day per seller. In this episode, we'll go inside the investigation with Lindsay Kaye, VP of Threat Intelligence, and Will Herbig, Senior Director of Media Research from Human Security, to break down how the sophisticated fraud was uncovered. The scammers took advantage of a massive blind spot. Unlike computers or phones, smart TVs don't run the standard security code that tracking tools use to spot fraud. To pull it off, the attackers used two main tricks. First, they hijacked the background systems that networks use to insert commercials. Second, they routed their fake traffic through everyday household internet connections, essentially making their digital footprints look like real families watching TV in their living rooms rather than a server farm. The fraud unraveled through end-to-end supply chain analysis, which flagged massive anomalies. We'll get into it in this discussion, and I really look forward to hearing your feedback, as always. Thanks so much. Hi, Lindsay. Will, it's good to be talking to you. How are you all doing today?
Doing quite well. I'm excited to speak with you as well.
Yeah, awesome. So maybe just to kick off, if you could just tell us a little bit about what you each do at Human and how you got there. Maybe start with you, Will, and then we'll talk a whole bunch about the report and what you all found.
Sounds great. Thanks, Rob. My name is Will Herbig. I'm the Senior Director of Media Security at Human Security. So I lead the research and development for our Media Guard product. So this product aims, and I'll be talking a bunch about it throughout this podcast. What it does is it aims in real time to give demand-side platforms, supply-side platforms, advertisers, publishers, visibility at time of bid request into what's likely to be invalid traffic. So we always say it's looking 10 milliseconds into the future. My background is in financial crime, so I've been chasing fraudsters for pretty much my whole career. I spent most of it working in management consulting, helping banks find fraud, money laundering, anti-corruption, all those kinds of different things. So being at the intersection of data and fraud is where I thrive. And as a team, we always joke we like to ruin a fraudster's day, and that's what we did in NewsJunkie. So looking forward to it.
We love ruining fraudster's days for sure. So Lindsay, tell us more about your background.
Thanks. So I'm Vice President of Threat Intelligence here at Human Security. So basically what my team does is work very closely with Will's team on a couple different things. So anytime there's OSINT investigation, any sort of reverse engineering. So while they have really great visibility into the IVT data, let's say, if you ever need kind of investigation to exactly how an app is operating, what is different fraud schemes, maybe it's part of a larger cyber criminal campaign or something like that, we come in and we work very closely with them. And ultimately, a lot of the research that we do, while we don't publish every single thing, everything we do publish, we work to make sure that we are adding these detections to our products to make them better. So really complementary kind of functions here.
That's awesome. So I saw the NewsJunkie report, and it was super interesting. And I mean, the scale just seems immense. So just help me get the kind of basic picture. So the way I understood it is, as someone who's not as deep in the CTV side of things as perhaps other stuff, someone's essentially making up fake televisions and households at massive scale, and then making advertisers pay for ads that nobody ever saw. Is that the right mental model, or am I missing something? Maybe you can kind of unpack it a little bit more for everyone.
Sure. Yeah. So that's definitely the right mental model. And I can give you a high level description of what the campaign involved. And then Will can talk a little bit more about the intricacies of CTV and sort of some of the additional technical details if that works for you.
That's great.
Great. So you were pretty much exactly right on the idea of these are not, in fact, these real CTVs. So basically what there were a set of apps. So a lot of local news apps and premium CTV apps. So that's actually part of how we named this operation. So NewsJunkie comes from the fact that there were so many different of these local news apps. And I'll talk a little bit about why that was so interesting. So cluster-related sellers that were transacting on the high volume, high VT inventory, pretending to be premium content, like I said, for those news apps and premium CTV apps. And what it was doing was largely exploiting the fact that there are limited measurement signals as part of the CTV ad ecosystem, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. So the supply chain, like you also said, was being flooded with all these synthetic bid requests that looked like real household viewers, but were actually not. So these are not people. that were actually seeing these ads, they were not real. So at peak, what we saw were there are hundreds of millions to nearly 2 billion invalid CTV bid requests per day per seller. So over a 2-month period, which is for one of the apps, what we saw was 42.2 billion bid requests, which is a huge amount. And part of how we were able to figure this out was there are a couple different anomalies. So a lot of the ways that we start to find different cybercriminal campaigns like this, especially with IVT, is by looking for anomalies and picking them out. So at a super high level, one of the things that we saw was a mismatch between, so a lot of these local news apps, you have some idea of like how many people you would expect to have this app, to download this app. And one of the ways that we're able to actually tell is if you look at the number of reviews for a particular app. So this one had 185 reviews for a local news app. And what we saw was that it really mismatched with the number of bids that we were seeing. So we saw those 42.2 billion requests over the 2 months, which is suggesting a lot more viewership, a lot more people kind of looking at this app than the amount of reviews, because that would be something they'd expect in proportion. An additional anomaly is that, again, because this was a Jacksonville local news app, you'd expect most of the people who would be looking at this would be actually in Jacksonville. But when we started to look, it was actually much more diverse than that. So Jacksonville actually ranked 21st in the list of where people were located. And then additionally, looking at the latency of the traffic. So you would expect that the latency of the traffic that was going to this app would largely match the rest of the latency of traffic, kind of like the background apps. But this was something that took a lot longer. So this is something that was suggestive of the use of residential proxies, which are generally used by cybercriminals to be able to obscure where they're coming from, the traffic, things like that. So again, that's something that, because the traffic was coming through residential proxies, again, suggesting something untoward was going on. And then finally, the representation of the network origin, which simply means that you would expect the reported IP at the time of the bid request to match the one in human bid data, but this was not in fact the case. So I guess if you want to dive in any more on any of those particular details, Will, I'm sure you have something to add as well.
Yeah, there were so many really interesting anomalies in this traffic, and that there's really not one single thing that pointed us to invalid traffic here, which, by the way, we'll be using the term invalid traffic quite a lot. In the advertising world, we don't necessarily use the word ad fraud all the time, because there are often sets of traffic that are violations of agreed upon industry standards, not necessarily fraudulent. For example, if you have an ad that is 51% off the page, that's an invalid ad that does not meet certain requirements, but that's not necessarily ad fraud. That's not malicious. So we use a blanket term called invalid traffic that is encompassing of everything, both fraud related. We also can infer intent usually. So invalid traffic is a much broader term here. So a lot of interesting things here. I just want to pause for a minute on the scale of this, because I think when we talk about bid requests, there's this question of like, well, what does that even mean? Like, what is X bid requests? Because MediaGuard is designed to use a metaphor here, to stop the bank robbery before it happens. We try to let people know where we think IVT is going to happen in the future, where it's likely to occur. We can't give you a monetary loss figure because, well, if we let the loss happen, then we didn't do our job. But to give some comparison numbers here, 2 billion requests a day. That's the total amount of ads viewed by a small city. Think of a city like Hartford, Connecticut. Not a huge city. We're not talking about New York City here, but we are talking about like that's a city of people. That's an entire group of people. The total cumulative ads that are transacted across this operation is of the magnitude of a small city. So when we think about that, when we think about the scale of this misrepresentation, it's pretty staggering. And I'm sure that these folks were making quite a lot of money for folks who are working with MediaGuard on this type of operation.
Well, yeah, that was one of my questions, which was like, putting this in the context of the overall CTV space. And I think also the other thing you kind of brought up, which is I always wonder about fraudsters when they kind of just go for a large amount because they think no one's watching, versus even if people were watching, they could probably get away with small amounts for a very long time. So I'm just curious how you think about those dynamics, both in terms of how this compares to the larger market. You've kind of answered that question with this is like the size of a city, but how did you think this compares with the size of other or the scale of other things you see, and over what time periods they seem to play out? This seems like pretty compressed, but I mean, is that typical, or are there other patterns that you see in these kinds of investigations?
Yeah, so this investigation, it's very possible we will write a follow-up piece on this, because what we described is one set of invalid traffic associated with this operation. What we didn't describe is all the things that happened afterward. So when we started investigating this, it was focused on these specific news channels. This operation still exists today. This operation is still attempting to gain money from advertisers on traffic that we believe to be not real impressions. And first of all, they have pivoted to every single operating system in CTV. There isn't a single operating system they haven't tried to impersonate traffic on. Maybe later we'll kind of zoom out macroscopically into how IVT operates in CTV, but that's one of the big benefits of having fake traffic rather than device farms. Device farms are kind of stuck with whatever device you got. But when you're impersonating traffic, when you're fabricating traffic, you can pivot from one operating system to the next. And also you can pivot to one app to the next. So what we're seeing today is an entirely different set of apps. They've pivoted now to some sports apps, maybe because of the World Cup, but they've pivoted entirely to fabricating some of these sports traffics. And we see some similarity in what we've described in this report, but also some very different nuances in how they are trying to emulate this traffic. And that's not uncommon whatsoever to see different actors in this space that are trying to pivot from one thing to the next. And Rob, to your point, what some actors will do is they will try to impersonate 1,000 apps. And they hope that if I can do a small amount of traffic on 1,000 apps, I can just kind of go under the radar. But where that really falls apart is in programmatic advertising, for better or for worse, you have to monetize through something. You have to monetize that there's a supply path. Ultimately, you can follow the money, and there should be some amount of traceability. And I'm sure later we'll talk about difficulties in the supply chain, truncated supply chain, things like that. But there is some ability to follow the money. So even if you have 1,000 app IDs, you need to monetize those through some kind of supply path. And that allows us to, in conjunction with Lindsay's team, to more deliberately pinpoint where the money's coming from.
I think one of the particularly interesting things that we've seen over the past couple of years is also, it's not just these ad fraud campaigns that sort of exist on their own to make the threat actors a whole lot of money. So, for example, with both of the Bad Box campaigns, we saw the ad fraud portion of it as part of the larger cybercriminal ecosystem campaign that they were running. So with the first Bad Box, it was Peach Pit. I don't remember exactly how many bid requests per day we saw at peak, but it was a pretty substantial portion. So you think about it also with Bad Box 2, we saw, again, they were back with the ad fraud. And while we don't necessarily know for sure, you could certainly imagine how this could have been part of what they were using to fund the other parts of the operation. So, putting some sort of malware on these devices in order to have, set up part of the residential proxy portion of it and all those other different modules. So if you look at it at the higher level, it's not just about the ad fraud and the making money there. It's maybe what are they using it for? Is this part of a larger operation? I think that's where the teams really work very well together to sort of say, okay, well, it's not just about the data here. What else could they be funding? What else could be part of this operation that we need to understand and ultimately try to disrupt?
I think that's also a good segue into the residential IP part of this, which I think is very interesting. Obviously, there's a bunch of, let's say, quote unquote, legitimate use cases for like companies using residential IPs. We could talk more about that in the larger context, but to talk a little bit about like how residential proxies and residential IPs are being used in this campaign. It doesn't sound like it's the whole thing here, but it also intersects in interesting ways with some of the Bad Box research I know you folks have done. So I'm curious how that part was used here, and then maybe the larger picture of residential proxies and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So residential proxies are a through line to Lindsay's earlier point. There is a lot of relationships between different threat actors that we observe. And although it was not the case, to my knowledge, that the residential proxies that we identified in this operation are related to Bad Box, the use of residential proxies is a pretty common way for actors to try and add legitimacy to their traffic. So just to kind of explain a bit of the rationale here, if you have traffic from a data center, which, by the way, there's legitimate reasons why traffic comes from a data center in the case of CTV around SSAI, which is called the server-side ad insertion. So there are reasons why that happens. But generally speaking, it's a lot less reputable, or it's more questionable if data comes from a data center. So if you can, you could impersonate a residential IP address in programmatic bid traffic. You declare whatever elements you want, but then in post-bid, someone is going to say, why don't these IPs match? And it's fairly obvious. So what you can do is you can route traffic through a residential proxy. You are going to quite literally, there's going to be a device that either someone knowingly or unknowingly is being used as a residential proxy exit node. And you're quite literally going to route traffic through that. So this is a way that you can have higher bits of legitimacy. Now, the residential proxy traffic is super, super interesting because there are sets of threat actors who generate residential proxies. This is what was one of the items in Bad Box. And then you have folks who consume residential proxies. In NewsJunkie, we did not observe bad box residential IPs, but in last year, we published Apollo, which was a very large audio impersonated scheme, which at its peak was about 10% of all audio ads were related to this scheme. And that one was routed through bad box devices. So what we observed is the residential IP addresses from infected bad box devices were being used as exit nodes for an audio scheme. So absolutely, there's a connection here. And to Lindsay's point, it's a connected web of how folks are generating infrastructure and then using that to cash out.
And we certainly see that this is a persistent problem. It has been for several years. And it's not something that we can expect to go away. So folks like Google and law enforcement, I'm sure you saw the recent disruption of the NetNut residential proxy service. And that's a fantastic step forward. But the one thing that, Will was talking about is this is very commonly used by threat actors to obscure and obfuscate where their traffic is coming from and add that air of legitimacy, because ultimately it makes it harder for us as defenders to disrupt them. So while there is that demand for the threat actors to have these services, people aren't going to stop finding ways to actually generate them. So I think a couple of years ago, we worked on an operation called ProxyLib, and that was a whole set of free VPN apps that added a device as a node in the residential proxy network. So there's so many different ways that they're building up for lack of a better word, inventory, the different IPs for these things, that this is something that we expect to see more, potentially connections to Bad Box or other of the residential proxy services that we have seen, as Will talked about Apollo. So this is something that will be a persistent issue, at least for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, no, I'm sure there's the, botnet residential proxies, and then there's the quote unquote ethically sourced, which I have lots of questions about, actually, in many cases.
They all claim to be ethically sourced, but at the end of the day, I don't think we have a lot of insight into what exactly that means or what exactly they mean by it, or really where the inventory is coming from. So
yeah, I agree with that.
Do with that as you wish.
Well, and Rob, this is a hotly debated topic in ad tech of should residential proxy traffic, irrespective of ethically sourced or not, be flagged as invalid traffic. And I think generally right now the answer is no, because real people can use it. But what's going on in NewsJunkie is we see high rates of residential proxy traffic. And there's no good explanation for why, and this isn't just limited to NewsJunkie, if a domain has a high rate of residential proxy traffic, maybe you have a security news site where people are especially privacy conscious, maybe you can make up some hypothetical here. But generally speaking, when you see high concentrations of residential proxies, it's not a good sign. And it's a pretty good indicator that something else is going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think the whole IP space is very interesting. And I recently was using a VPN, a commercial VPN, to access something that I wasn't so sure. But the thing was also auto detecting where it thought I was coming from. And so my Dallas, Texas, supposedly IP was detected as coming from China. So I'm assuming that that particular commercial provider is being used a lot by folks over there or whatever. I mean, it's unclear in some cases. A lot of this is kind of, obviously there's a lot here. So the other thing that I found was super interesting that you all talked about in the report was AI-generated employee profiles for the sellers. I'd love you to talk more about that, because I think the whole spoofing identities, spoofing companies, all these other, having enough details in there so that people don't ask too many questions is obviously a real theme for fraudsters and fraud in general. So I'd love to hear more about that part.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a very interesting aspect of this operation is the global supply chain, which we can come back to later. Because what we observe here is what's called ephemeral sellers. This operation, it appears, made sellers specifically to elongate the supply chain and to kind of obfuscate where the traffic is coming from. And when you make a new seller, kind of intermediary in the supply chain, you need to have a company for it. And that company needs to have a LinkedIn profile. And in those LinkedIn profiles, there needs to be some amount of connection to some people in ad tech, and there needs to be a profile picture and all these kinds of things. So what we observed, and I don't remember how much of this is in the report, but what we observed is both AI-generated profile pictures where there's this very classic weird neck look in AI-generated content. And we observe that in multiple of the profiles here of some of the employees at these companies, where the proportions of the body just don't look like they should. And we also observe images. So when we reverse image search some of these images, we find new LinkedIn profiles of people in completely different countries that seem to have legitimate jobs with full job histories. Maybe those are also fake profiles, but they don't look like it. They look like just random people who they stole the images of. So there's all this circumstantial evidence that suggests to us that these companies were very quickly made, and they were trying to have enough of a paper trail that if someone doesn't look too hard, it's okay. Not having a LinkedIn page is very strange, but having one with a couple employees on it and some LinkedIn profiles is kind of enough to pass the sniff test.
But I guess one of the super crazy parts of it is if you look at some of these images, right, you see, okay, this is very obviously AI. And I think a couple of years ago, you'd be able to look at a lot of different images of profile pictures or other things out there, like the hands would be funny, things like that. A lot of those indicators would be like, oh, yes, this is obviously AI. But now these models are just getting so much better and more effective that, I don't know, at least I have to look very closely. So it's like Will said, like it seems like threat actors just have just enough air of legitimacy, a little bit presence here on the website. Sometimes you'll see like the company's board of directors, and for example, it'll have just first names, and then somebody's like finance and CEO, and that's kind of all the employees. So it's like, okay, well, pretty low effort, but it's just enough so we can be able to start to pick those things out as maybe this is not legitimate. But you can certainly see a future where now that the technology is better at generating these images, and as threat actors sort of catch on to what are some of the things that, we see as, oh, this is very much fake, you can certainly see a future in which these will start to get better. And it might be a little bit harder for us to start picking out, okay, is this a real company? Is this not?
Yeah, I now look at some of these, this person does not exist profile pics that I think are pretty easy to pick out now as, GAN, generative adversarial network, whatever they're called. Those are like so easy to pick out now versus the current ones that people are using, and the fakes. You said that this operation is still ongoing, so it's been disrupted, I think you said as well in the report. But what does a win look like, or what would a win look like here? I mean, this is obviously a win. Disrupting it, bringing attention to it, I think is good. But what is like, the next level of disruption look like for this type of operation?
So from my point of view, disruption has maybe 3 different levels to it. First is kind of the most baseline level. We need to protect our customers. That's what my job is. That is my goal, is to make sure as much as possible our customers are not exposed to the risk of this inventory. And our customers control their bidding decisions. They decide what to do with information that we think is probabilistically invalid. But that said, we try to communicate that and as much as possible mitigate the risks of customers for these. So kind of layer 1 is in our predictive engine in MediaGuard. We try to expose these to customers. The second piece of disruption here, the kind of layer 2, is going to be education and kind of intelligence exchanges with some of the folks in the industry. So we at Human, we have what's called the Human Collective, which is a group of customers and non-customers who are interested in removing as much ad fraud and invalid traffic at its source as we can. And what we'll do is we will send a more detailed than what we published advisory that lists a lot of information on supply paths and what kind of how they can identify this traffic in their supply chains. And to that point, we're trying to go to the root of this. If we just did layer one, if we just protected via our product, then only customers who work with us, only people who have MediaGuard are going to get mitigation on this. We don't just want to punt the problem to the people who don't work with us. We don't want to concentrate those risks of loss to those folks, because then the bad actors are still making money. There's still an incentive to do this type of ad fraud. And so what we want to do is we want to go to the education level and say, here are sellers with this type of risk. Here's indicators of compromise, IOCs, of how you can identify this. And here's what you can do with that information. The kind of third layer that we didn't pursue here, but we have pursued in things like Badbox and elsewhere, is trying to disrupt the infrastructure itself. So maybe Lindsay can talk a little about this in the context of Badbox or elsewhere, where we are trying to either quite literally get the actors removed from some of their infrastructure components, get their servers taken down, things like that we're trying to do. And there's actually maybe a fourth layer here, which is working with law enforcement, which we have done in the case of MethBot, which we ultimately helped the FBI in getting a conviction on. So, but those are all like much, much harder and much more complex to do.
Let's zoom out a little bit. So a lot of this is exploiting the fact that connected TV or CTV doesn't have detection signals or firm identity or other aspects. So who should be closing that gap? I mean, I think, is it like your television maker, your ISP? Like who's essentially the group or groups leaving the door open for this kind of stuff to happen? How do you think about that? Where are the systemic or systematic gaps in the ecosystem or supply chain, as you put it?
Yeah, I think the responsibility is born with every step of this. So from the SSPs to the DSPs to the device manufacturers to the app developers, I think everyone can be doing better here. Let me first start by talking about the least sexy thing that's ever come up on your podcast: Ads.txt compliance, and sellers.json compliance. So what's called supply chain compliance is a very important part of the ecosystem. And for those that aren't familiar, this is the general idea that if I own a sports app, I'm going to list on my website who I'm selling to. And if I'm an intermediary supplier, I'm going to list where I'm getting my supply from. And that way, where we kind of have both side verification of where ad dollars are flowing or where they should be flowing. Now, that's kind of the idea in principle. In practice, you have ads.txt files that aren't updated. You have sellers.json files that aren't updated. You have folks transacting traffic that they forgot to add. You have data quality issues that make it look like something is non-compliant when it isn't. You have folks truncating the supply chain. So truncating supply chain is when you go from the app, it goes to seller A, to seller B, to seller C, and then ultimately to a DSP, demand-side platform, and then ultimately the advertiser. Someone along the way, not even maliciously, can truncate the supply path. They can just say, anything that happened before me in the supply chain, I'm just going to delete it out and kind of move forward. And this happens more frequently than we'd like. And it's not necessarily something that's invalid. So the reason I bring all this up is in the report, we talk a bit about ephemeral sellers. These are sellers that existed for, let's say, less than 3 months. Like they were very new sellers who appeared to only transact with some of these culminating sellers before they get to some of our customers. And when we look at the supply chain compliance there, what we observe is the supply chain hop right before it comes to one of our customers is almost always valid. That means that our customers and that seller say they work together. But before that, first of all, the supply chain might be truncated, but before that, it's kind of a big question mark. Somewhere along the line, there is some bit of non-compliance. And ultimately, if you go all the way to the beginning, either the apps themselves don't declare that they work with the first seller we see, or the supply chain is truncated and there was some other seller here that was ads.txt verified that we didn't see. So why does all this matter? If these types of things were held to a higher standard and these things were enforced, this type of traffic would be a lot harder to do. This operation could have been entirely avoided without human if people were just strictly following supply chain compliance standards. And what I mean by that is verifying every single hop in the supply chain, every single node in the supply chain, if it had proper compliance checks, this type of operation wouldn't have been possible. And that's actually also the case in Apollo. We wrote about the same thing 9 months ago in the Apollo audio fraud operation, where again, these types of things could have been circumvented. Now, why don't they do it? Well, because people will lose money. And because if you remove anyone who's not on an Ads.txt file, both the publisher and probably the SSPs and maybe even some of the DSPs would lose money in this. It's hard to keep all these things aligned, but I think it is worthwhile to raise the standard of what's acceptable as an industry and to have a better enforcement of that. So that's kind of like one big thing we can be doing across the entire ad tech ecosystem that would help dramatically reduce these types of IT operations.
Yeah, look, I think misaligned incentives is one of the things that we talk about on this podcast. And I mean, I've worked on e-privacy cookie notice compliance for Google, so you can't bore me. There's no level of compliance boredom that I will suffer. But I think that's actually a great point about the incentives for SSPs and others who are transacting. And ultimately, it's a lot of times it's the advertiser that's bearing the costs, and frankly, like the problem about measuring outcomes and so on also plays into this. When it's harder to measure outcomes, you also then miss a lot of things that are going on in the background, unfortunately. So, are there kind of any other like structural fixes? Are there things the ISPs could be doing differently as well? Like in terms of if you look at the nature of what connected TV looks like, I mean, it's very difficult if you're just relying on an IP address only, for example, as an identifier. What are some of the other structural things that we should consider as an industry to try to counter this type of stuff?
Yeah, I think it would be remiss of me to not bring up device attestation. So, and I'm using that term very broadly here to also include things like Roku watermark. That's not technically device attestation, but is very similar thematically. So these types of these sections of traffic, and what these are is at the device level, there is an encrypted token that is passed to passed to human or passed to elsewhere, where human has a private key that we can decrypt it and verify that there's an actual device behind whatever. One of the challenges here is server-side ad insertion. So for those that aren't familiar, there's a variety of ways CTV traffic can load ads. One of them is kind of calling an ad server and loading an ad, but you can also, at the content player level, you can actually stitch in the ad basically through the originating content provider. And when those things happen, the ad auction is occurring through a lot of the information we're getting is through a server. It is not through the endpoint device. And in those cases, device attestation, at least as it's designed today, won't work. And I want to be super clear here. Device attestation is excellent. I strongly encourage that every device manufacturer should be pursuing this type of work. And I think it'll go a long way to mitigating this, but it's not silver bullet here. It is not something that is going to single-handedly stop CTV invalid traffic, but it will make it much harder. And if we kind of focus, if it kind of causes IVT to concentrate on SSAI servers, it's almost a good thing, because now we can start working with SSAI servers. Maybe there's a world where we have device attestation via SSAI servers, which I don't believe there's even a standard proposed for. But that would be a very challenging problem, but one that would go, again, a long way towards mitigating this.
So if you think about what player or industry component or person or company, I should say, could move the needle most here to move in that direction, I mean, today, who do you think that is, or what area do you think that might be?
I would say it's the device manufacturers, and I think they largely are. For I don't have the numbers in front of me, but for maybe 4 of the top 10 OSs in CTV have or are building a device attestation. So that's a good chunk of traffic that has this, and there's at least, I know, some discussion of people toying with it in folks outside of those 4. So there is movement here. These things are slow. There's a lot of different parties that need to interact to make a device attestation successful, or a watermark successful. So those things takes time, but it is something that's moving forward.
That's really helpful. So if we zoom out even further, kind of one of the things that I like to ask people about on here is how they see AI affecting the trust, the security landscape. So my question for Lindsay, so I mean, when I see stuff like this, and then I think about, okay, AI is not only helping create more plausible fake stuff, like maybe a fake employee profile, but also it's automating more actions or allowing actions to be automated. Should we be hopeful or terrified about what AI is doing to the security landscape? Like, how do you think about where we're at in this evolution right now?
Sure. So largely when we look at how AI is used in a lot of cyber attacks and cyber threats, and even in sort of the IVT and media space, what we see is that it's not a new cyber threat landscape. It's not necessarily a new TCP that we need to be aware of. It's more used as a way of augmenting some of the existing threats that we see. So very basically on the enterprise side, one of the things that human looks a lot at is things like carding, scalping, scraping, different things like that. So where we see AI used there is it's another way to use, let's say, agentic AI and AI browsers to conduct carding attacks, to conduct monitor attacks, basically making it so that it's more scalable, more efficient. People can effectively get in on doing cybercrime more easily. So it's democratizing the idea of cybercriminal threats. So whereas it used to be people would have to find a tool, maybe an all-in-one toolkit, things like that, they could instead now start to trick and, I guess, subvert some of these browsers in order to be able to, let's say, conduct that kind of attack. Now, also on the media side, what we see, to your point, is that it's, again, augmenting the number of things like apps and content. So first of all, with slop ads, we saw that a lot of the apps looked very much like they had that veneer of AI generation. So some of the campaigns that we used to disrupt in the past couple of years, you'd see like 20, 30, 40 apps, a significant number, but not the numbers that we're seeing today. So I believe it was over 200 for slop ads, several hundred for some of the other ones that we're seeing. So it's just so much easier for threat actors to generate these apps, get them in the app store, do IVT, let's say that app gets taken down. Okay, they can just generate another one. So they can kind of keep these operations going and up to scale and things like that. Again, with push propaganda, which focused on AI-generated lures that tricked people into downloading additional kind of malware and things like that. What we saw was that, okay, they were using AI to generate these lures, and it wasn't necessarily a person behind having to do all of that. So when we see what threat actors are doing, again, it's largely to augment the existing threats that we know at this point in time. So you asked whether or not we should be scared or hopeful. So I guess at this point, cautiously hopeful that, right now, the art of how this is all working is that it's mostly threats that we know and we understand, just conducted in a slightly different way. So as defenders, if we're looking to, take down these apps, expecting there to be more of them, potentially having that veneer of AI-generated content. If we're looking to stop things like carding attacks or monitor attacks, things like that, okay, yes, they're still using the kind of same techniques that we know, but they're conducting it in a slightly different way. So while we as defenders need to have some element of upskilling and understanding sort of that new way in which they're using these tools to conduct the old threats, it's not something where we're completely unprepared to do so, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. So it's kind of like these tools are lowering the skill floor, but it's not necessarily changing the tactics entirely. It's kind of building on top of things we've seen already. So the other thing that I'm really interested about your view on, I've seen this myself as well, is that using off-the-shelf models, there's a lot of refusals for defenders where they're like, oh, it looks like this thing you're trying to do might be related to a bad, you might be trying to do something bad and trying to tell me that it's good. And like, no, actually, I'm trying to do something good. I also saw the other thing, a thing recently where malware writers are putting like nuclear-related terms into their malware to try to get scanning tools to ignore the malware. So it's kind of spy versus spy. So how do you give me some sense of, do you folks run into that kind of issue yourselves in terms of the work that you do? You're seeing defenders also get blocked by stuff that's, essentially aimed at attackers, but now, people are seeing that as well.
So I know that a lot of the models that attackers are using do have those safeguards, but one of the things that's very interesting is sometimes you'll see them have different ways of subverting it. Like I think there was some research where they had tried to, get it to conduct a little cyber attack on their behalf just to see, and they said, okay, well, no, this is just for security purposes. We're just testing the AI. I was like, oh, okay, I totally get it. So it's one of the things where it's, like AI has those safeguards and they are putting them in, which is fantastic news for us as defenders. But it's also like understanding how and if it can be tricked in the future. Hopefully it will continue to get better. But then there's also the jailbroken models that are out there. So really sort of looking at how people are abusing these different things, like, as you know, as soon as you put some sort of block or some sort of prevention in the way of threat actors trying to make money through, let's say, advertising fraud or other sort of cyber criminal fraud, they're going to try and find a way around it. So from the defensive side, I think we see that substantially less, in that most of our focus on AI is not trying to trick or subvert it, mostly how to understand how threat actors are tricking and subverting it and the different ways in which they can do so in order to conduct attacks, at least from the visibility that my team and I have. A lot of it is just trying to prevent the different types of attacks that we, all know and love, but now some of them are conducted with AI. Maybe threat actors are subverting these, or maybe they're just kind of using it in a way it was intended to be, but also that is in a way that is potentially malicious.
Yeah. So a question for each of you. I'm not going to ask you necessarily how you found this exploit, but feel free to tell me if you want. But how do you get inspired and find bad stuff happening in general terms? Like what's your process, or how do you think about the going and looking for things? I'm curious to the extent that you could share any things that might be coming up next, or it sounds like obviously you have a lot of irons in the fire with stuff that you've already explored and you're continuing to work on. But what are ways in which you find bad stuff out there? What's your process for doing it? And I'm sure a lot of security investigators and folks are just innately curious about things, but tell us a little bit more about how you think about that.
Yeah, I'll go first. So I have a background in fraud, so I always take a follow the money, not always, but I take a follow the money approach, where what we're trying to do is look at supply paths, look at sellers, look at people who ultimately are making money from it, and say, what's weird about this? In the case of NewsJunkie, there were a few dozen things that were weird. It's not always that clear cut, but are there instances where we see uncommon traffic patterns? Are there weird either JavaScript signals we're collecting or network telemetry on a seller? Generally speaking, we expect sellers to be insulated from a lot of different anomalies. Me transacting on a certain website should be completely irrelevant to the amount of Chrome or Firefox or whatever that's visiting the site. So we can kind of do all these types of anomaly detection investigations on a seller and say, what's weird about this seller? And then we just start pulling the string. And from there, we might loop in Lindsay's team and we're like, hey, go see if you can find, something about this website or something about this company. And then we'll just keep pulling on the string, and then we'll find things like NewsJunkie.
So I guess from the other side of the perspective is we've been following the operation, for example, Bad Box, since I believe early 2022. And it is something where the threat actors have rebranded, they get new tools, like pretty much any cyber criminal group, but being able to continue to follow that. So what are the new residential proxy services? Are there new ways that they are doing ad fraud? So being able to kind of follow those pieces and parts. And sometimes it's like you're able to link particular TTPs to another group that is also related. So now you dig on that if that is something of interest. So being able to continue to follow a lot of these operations, and sometimes we uncover new threats doing so, is something that ultimately, just when we disrupt, let's say, the ad fraud portion, or let's say a residential proxy portion of an operation, that doesn't mean it's over. So being able to continue to follow these as they change, as they evolve, discover new groups, ties to other groups, with the overlap, for example, with Apollo and the Bad Box residential proxy network. So it seems like a lot of these things are intertwined in various different ways that will lead us from threat to threat to threat. And I mean, it keeps us certainly very busy, and I'm sure Will can attest to that one.
Well, and building on that, Lindsay, I mean, I think one of the things we talk about at Human all the time is collective protection. So if we can go and disrupt the residential proxy IPs of Bad Box, then we get an ancillary benefit here that it makes Apollo's life harder. And when we disrupt Apollo, then we are stopping people from purchasing the infected IPs of Bad Box. So all these things are related. And whenever you can make the days more difficult to fraudsters for one of these rings, undoubtedly, there's this cascading effect for all these related parties where they're having to do something different. And We're always talking about disrupting the economics of cybercrime. We want to make it harder and harder. We want to make you have to jump through more hoops, increase the cost per unit that you as the fraudster have to go through. These are a lot of the ways that we try and do it.
Love that. One final thing, Lindsay, I believe you've written a book. Is that right? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I have. Sure. The book is called Dissecting the Dark Web, Reverse Engineering the Tools of the Underground Economy. It's published by No Starch Press. And the basic structure of the book is we look at a variety of dark web tools, so things like stealers, cryptors, initial access, how vulnerabilities things are bought and sold. And then after we discuss how they're sold, why they're marketed in certain ways, what I do is I walk you through reverse engineering of one of them. So you can sort of see how a lot of the context behind it contributes to how the tool works. And then I turn it over to you as the reader to be able to actually do it on your own. So for people who are interested in understanding how does the cyber criminal ecosystem work, how does the dark web work, while also starting to learn a little bit about reverse engineering and malware analysis, I think this is a great opportunity. So you get a little bit of the context and you get a little bit of the technical stuff. We go from initial access all the way up through dropping of ransomware, simply because that is something that I think most people conceptually understand. But I think it's a fun read, personally.
Yeah, it sounds great. I'm gonna get a copy of that.
Let me know how you like it.
Yeah, I will. I absolutely will. And maybe we'll have a follow up some point and talk more about these kinds of tools. Any final thoughts, Will, and then Lindsay, in terms of this investigation and some of the maybe unexpected things you learned from it, if at all?
Yeah, for me, I guess my closing thought is IVT on CTV, invalid traffic on CTV, is not a solved problem. It's still there. People are still making wild amounts of money. And although we as an industry have made it harder and have reduced the prevalence of it, it's still there. And it's still something we need to be vigilant about. It's still something we as an industry need to be working on closing all these different gaps, whether it's supply chain or device attestation or data quality in CTV, that we all need to be working on. So it's not something any one individual can solve. It's something we as an industry need to work on. So I look forward to partnering with all your listeners and improving all those things.
I think that's such a great point, Will, of the idea of upping the cost and making it more painful for threat actors to make money off of different types of fraud. So companies like Human and other people who work in sort of the defensive landscape, that's what we're ultimately trying to do. Every disruption is fantastic. None of these are solved problems. Residential proxies and ad fraud are never going to go away, but the more expensive and more painful we can make for threat actors to do it, the closer we get to a safer internet for everybody.